All right, let's get right into it. Before we start, I just want to apologize if I look tired. It's because I am. It's been kind of a long week, but nevertheless, we push onwards. Let's get right into this week's sound. Instead of breaking down the sound from the preset page, I've gotten some requests to start breaking it down from scratch. So let's open up a brand new, fresh instance of Serum 2. This way we can start building the sound from scratch. So this week, because I'm a little tired, I decided to go over one of the more simple presets in my upcoming preset pack for Serum 2. So the basis of this sound is this analog BD sine, which you can find by going to analog and analog BD sine. Now, sine waves by themselves are a great starting point for any bass sound because, well, they're a single tone. And we can see that if we pull up an analyzer like span, if I play any note, right, it's basically just one tone. In this case, you have some slight harmonics because I'm using an analog sine wave and not a digital sine wave. But you get the point. It's one tone that you can clearly see. So I'm actually going to go right ahead and drop this down 2 octaves so that when I press my middle C on my MIDI keyboard, it plays C3 in Serum. That way I just don't have to, move my keyboard up and down constantly. For my bass sounds, I like to program them so that when I press middle C, I get a low C. You can see here, that lives around 67 hertz. So sine waves are great because they provide a really strong bass. But by themselves, they don't really have many upper harmonics, making it difficult to hear on smaller devices like your phone, for example, or like a smaller set of speakers. And that could be an issue. It's an issue both audibly and it's an issue in terms of character. So what we can do, thankfully, thanks to Serum 2, is we can click this little pencil icon here right by the oscillator. And when we open that, we can see that we have a whole bunch of little lines here. These lines represent the harmonic spectrum. So we can clearly see that the fundamental over here, which is the first line, is the loudest. And then all these other ones are just like tiny, tiny, tiny harmonics. Because again, a sine wave is just one tone. In this case, it's analog, so we have some other harmonics. So what I decided to do for this preset is I wanted the bass to be slightly more crunchy, but not by much. So what I did is I simply physically drew in the harmonics. So I drew in the second one here, and the third one, I think they're about at the same level, the fourth and the fifth. So now it sounds like this. We can see those harmonics popping up on span as well. So before we could just see the fundamental over here, and now we see these other harmonics that we've added in over here. So I love making bass sounds this way because it gives me so much control in terms of physically adding the exact number of harmonics that I want to my bass sound. I think that's a fantastic way to have control over your bass sound because you can always flip through these wavetables, but each one of them has their own pre-assigned amount of harmonics. And so sometimes, like in this case, I want a very specific amount of harmonics because I don't want it to be too bright, but I also don't want it to be too dark. So once we've made our oscillator the way we like it to be, with the amount of harmonics that we like, we can go ahead and start fine-tuning our envelope. For this sound, I had my attack set to 0.8, and then I had quite a long decay time. I had a decay time of about 4.7 seconds, which was quite long, and then I had a release time of 20 milliseconds. So this is what it sounds like now that we've dialed in our envelope. And then the final major component of this bass sound is an FM component. So I turned on oscillator B, went to analog BD sine again. This time I left it at the regular octave. So this one's at -2, this one's at 0. And then I simply went to my first oscillator and set the FM source from B. I also turned down the level of oscillator B because I don't want to hear it. I just want to hear oscillator A. So now it sounds exactly the same, but when I turn up this knob over here, it's going to start introducing the FM wave. And if you go super high, obviously it turns to crazy distortion. So I kind of liked it around, maximally around 19 or 20%. So what I did is I mapped the velocity to the FM knob over here, and I set my max amount to about 20%. So now, when I play at a low velocity, we don't really hear any FM going on. But when we play at a higher velocity, we start to hear that FM. For the noise, I chose this little micro Korg noise, and by itself it's a little bright. So I'm pretty sure I sent it to filter number 2, filter number 2, and dialed it in just like this. So I cut out some of those super harsh top end frequencies. You don't really need any of those for bass. And I also set the voicings to mono. Now we can go to the actual sound. So as you can see, I don't think I started with an analog BD Sine. I think I started with a digital one because as you can see, there's no harmonics here. But it makes very, very little difference. Those tiny upper harmonics you can barely even hear them. Quick pause. If you want better sounds, I just dropped a bunch of free packs. I've got my Tech House Serum 2 preset pack. I've got my Radix drum kit. I've got a Prophet 5V guide. I've got Afro House kicks. And finally, we have our Voyager Serum 2 preset pack. You can find the link to all of those down below. So let's look into how I developed this sound now. For LFO1, I have this super, super narrow LFO going on, this short spike, if you will. And what I did with that is I assigned LFO1 to the main tuning. So as you hit it, you get that little knocking effect. And then I set macro 8 as a knock source and labeled it attack. So at this low amount, you can barely hear it, but if I turn it up, you'll be able to hear that knock that I'm talking about. But I don't want it that much, obviously. I also just introduced a filter. It's at 3,601 hertz. It's not doing much, it's just cutting out some of those upper frequencies. And the rest of this sound is pretty much determined by the effects chain. I've got this hyper dimension over here. I'm not using the hyper of it at all, I'm using the dimension, and that's mapped to macro number 3 over here. As you can see, actually I am using the hyper, but I'm only using it a little bit. So the maximum amount is very small, the maximal amount is bigger on this dimension part of it. So that's if you want to have a super wide bass at some point. Next we have a compressor. Mine is 22.2 dB, 4:1 ratio, slow-ish attack time, slow-ish release time, and then some makeup gain. Just doing a little bit of compression to tighten up the sound. I feel like compression 80 to 90% of the time on any bass sound gives it a lot of body. Next up we have distortion. I'm using a soft clip distortion. I've got the drive up at 90%, and then the mix is mapped to this macro number 1 over here. So as you can see, it's set to about 29%, nothing crazy, but if I turn it up, you start to hear more distortion. I didn't think that the sound needed that much distortion by default, but I wanted to include it if you want a slightly more aggressive sound. Next up, we have a filter on this sample and hold setting, which can be found in this miscellaneous category, and then sample and hold. I've got the cutoff at 920 hertz. The reso is pretty high, 81%, no drive, and the mix is set to 0 by default, but I've got it mapped to macro number 4 over here. And I like to sometimes include what I call a break macro in my presets. And it's kind of like an extreme macro where if you want to mangle your sound, you're welcome to do so. I sometimes like to do that purely for, how do I put it? Sonic pleasure. I'll leave it at that. This is what it sounds like. Why wouldn't you want to do that? I love the sound of that. Maybe not all the time, but like occasionally. Next, we've got an equalizer doing looks like absolutely nothing. So you don't even have to put it there if you're copying this preset. Next up, we got the chorus, which is pretty much at its default setting, 0.08 hertz, feedback at 10%. These are all standard settings. I've just got it mapped to macro number 5 over here. By default, it's left at 0, but if you raise it, love a bit of chorus on bass. Next, we've got another filter, this time on high 18, and this is being used as a high-pass filter. I sometimes like including a high-pass filter in my presets because I find it convenient, right? I just don't, it's one less plugin that I have to load, so why not do it if it's available, if I have the CPU bandwidth within Serum 2 to do so. I'll sometimes put it in. Next up, we've got, for macro number 7, we've got this macro tied to the mix on this convolve. I've got it on the tiled setting, which you can find under factory, medium, and then tiled. I didn't really touch any of the settings, I don't think. Size is at 52%, tone is in the middle, and then I've simply got the macro mapped to the mix knob, so that's without it. With it, it puts the bass in a room, and I quite like the sound of that. I think it fits the preset very nicely. And then the attack we've been over already. That's tied to LFO 1. And that pretty much does it for the entire preset. The main thing that I wanted to go over was this, drawing your own harmonics in. I can't tell you how useful this is in Serum 2, right? You can start off like I did in the beginning with an analog BD sine. That's gonna have slightly more upper harmonics by default. It looks like over here I started with a digital one because I don't see any of these upper harmonics. And I simply just physically drew them in. And I use some piece of software like Span. And as I'm drawing the harmonics in, I'll have a careful look at how they're behaving. So if you don't know about Span, it's one of the best spectrum analyzers out there. It's absolutely free. I like to go into high res mode here when I'm sound designing, and I'll just hit a C. And then I'll press hold over here. And now I can see exactly the harmonics that I drew in. So you can see these harmonics correspond exactly to these ones over here. So I can see my fundamental is the loudest, the first harmonic is a little bit quieter, then a little bit quieter, a little quieter. And I love the sound of that. And I get to see my sound on an analyzer, and I get to see how the harmonics are behaving. I see that I have a great fundamental over here, and that's all you need. I feel like every preset pack should have at least one really solid sine wave bass, because it just works for so many genres. It works in dance music, it works in pop, it works in hip hop. It's just a universally amazing bass sound. So I wanted to include one for this preset pack as well. This little LFO trick that we went over with tying that to the main tuning is another trick that I love to do, especially with sine wave basses, because I find that they will typically lack a little bit of that initial attack that you'll maybe get with saw-based bass sounds or square wave-based bass sounds. So this is another really, really useful tip. Setting this LFO at a super short amount and then tying it to the main tuning and then creating a macro for it as well. So if you want a little bit more attack, you can just easily change this knob over here and you instantly get more attack that oftentimes those sine basses are missing out on. There's nothing more to it. That's it for this week's preset. Thank you for sticking with me. I hope that I was understandable during this recording. I hope that I explained everything decently well. This is my first time starting a preset from scratch, kind of from memory. So let me know if you preferred that this time around. Let me know if that worked or if I just sucked. I'm also open to absolute criticism. So yeah, thank you for sticking around with Tired Me this week. I really appreciate it as always. And I'll see you next week with another sound design video. And I think next week will be a slightly more complicated one. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to have way more energy and we move on. Thank you again. Have a good night.